Let's see. All right. Well, hello. I usually like to avoid having meta commentary, if there's a recording, because that's a little weird. You got to do that little t equals some seconds for the recording. But this has been some great talks, and it's always nice to be here at DevOps Days. I really appreciate it. So far, if the rest of the talks are good, even if mine's terrible, you'll have a good time from the two that you've had. So what I want to go over, and I assure you, we didn't plan coordinate ahead of time, the previous talk and I, but it's great because that gives you kind of a tools look at what things are, definitional. It was really nice to look at. And what I want to focus on is, this started off as like talking about metrics and things like that. I don't know if you read the same thing I do, but there was a great nerd fight last fall when McKinsey came out with this developer productivity metrics thing, which spawned all sorts of discussion. It wasn't as good as, I think it was maybe the 2012 bimodal IT discussion. Maybe that was 2009, which is fantastic, very choice. You should look that up if you haven't read it. It's a good, I don't think anyone who was saying bimodal was bad paid the $5,000 for the Gartner PDF, but that shouldn't make you think it was not good. Good stuff. So this is a little bit of an evolution of what was going on way back then. But I think it's also thinking about, like, what are we going to do in this era of DevOps? How can we prepare for it? I like the idea of DevOps X. That kind of has a nice feel to it. Now, the first thing when you're thinking about developer productivity and metrics that I think is, that you want to know is you just want to know which metrics to use, right? You're like, I don't know, do I really need to sit through 20 more minutes of this nonsense? Can you just tell me which metrics that I should be using? Now, of course, all the thought leaders and the masters are going to tell you you're a terrible person and you shouldn't be asking for metrics, which is what the rest of the talk will be like, so you can say, I'm not a terrible person. But let me give you the answers, right? Now, as I covered, it depends, right? Now, whenever I encounter it depends, I'm like, how much is this consulting bill going to be, right? Like, I want to know, like, why don't you just give me the answers? Like, let's go over it. But it is true, as I'll get into. It's very genuine that, like, it's hard to apply lots of these metrics perfectly the first time. And especially since I imagine a lot of you are lower down the hierarchy, you got to be really careful about just going in with some metrics that may have, is it retributive sort of actions based on not really analyzing the it depends much. Now, ideally, nonprofits and governments aside, but you can kind of substitute in there. What you would like with metrics is as direct connection to money as possible, right? You want to say, am I being productive? Here's how much money I helped you make, right? Now, it's a little dangerous to say, here's how much money I saved, because that usually means here's how many people I got rid of. But somehow you want to connect what you're doing to the actual outcomes, as we say in the business, the value, like these sorts of things. But I think the problem with software is, especially in what I would call, in a good way, normal companies, enterprises, I'll say, to bring that word up, the connection between the business and the IT shop, those people in the poorly lit, out-of-date sort of facilities, they're probably using, like, old machines that are 6 years old because their refresh cycle is out of date. You can kind of see that they're not really valued and thought about as contributing to the business so much. So that connection is very tenuous and difficult to make. And so instead, we come up with a series of other metrics. And this is kind of an overview. There's another one that I'll get to later, but this is probably the last 2-3 years or so. If I could read that tiny type, I could tell you. But what we've really evolved from is this nice sort of it depends sort of situation where it depends, and here are the frameworks that will help you no pun intended, it'll help you figure out what your depends are. It will ask you kind of a series of questions, kind of have you look at what you think productivity and how it applies, and eventually you'll kind of go down to one. And I'm going to very much so simplify it. And really, the kind of state-of-the-art in developer productivity is like, are your developers happy? And if you can say yes to that, chances are they've got good productivity, right? That's sort of, again, I'm no academic, I just read PDFs. But like, that's sort of what a lot of this amounts to, which is great, right? Like, and it intuitively makes sense. The other way I think about it, back when I was a developer, is like, just stop interrupting me. Right? Like, that's a lot of developer productivity as well. But I would encourage you to look at these, right? And think of them as almost sensing mechanisms for coming up with what the metrics will be and the answer to what it depends is. And the second thing to give you the answers, just what to do that I'm going to build up to is, I think what I've observed over however many years, it's good not to remember how many years, is that when organizations are talking about developer productivity, they're not so interested in what, I don't know if you kids still use these terms, they're not really interested in the inner loop, what developers are doing when their fingers are on the keyboard, or what apparently AI is going to replace at some point. If you're interested in another career that involves not coding, I could give you my tips on doing that. I had a similar thing in the 2000s. Anyways, not really the inner loop, but more of what happens around the application cycle, getting your code into production, going through all the governance, all of those sorts of things. And one of my theories is that if you focus on that a lot more, you probably won't really so much care about developer productivity, but you'll improve why you care about developer productivity, which is more about release cycles and getting features out and all sorts of things like that. So before that, this is me, as you can tell. I usually wear that shirt, but my dog got very nervous and ripped a big hole in it, which is unfortunate. So my run on that shirt has run out. But I've been really lucky for, I don't know, the past 10 years, and then many years before that, to work at Pivotal and now then VMware, and now as we call it, VMware Tanzu by Broadcom. Which is great. But I've had the chance to write lots of books and do lots of podcast stuff. I was an analyst, all sorts of nonsense like that. You should, as a friend of many of us here likes to say, engage with my brand. And I won't show you my various hair configurations because it's been the same forever, which I stress out about. You ever notice when you were younger, you were like, what's up with all the old people in the same hair all the time? And now I think I've become that. So if you're worried about developer productivity and metrics, the first very important thing to do is to ask, who's asking, right? As I've kind of alluded to. And this is not the most important thing. I don't like to rank things, but it's definitely top 3. And it's really going to let you narrow down to what you would do out of all the possible things. Now, in my view, right, in normal organizations and enterprises, and probably for the purposes of doing this, the person who's asking is usually this guy, right? Or gal, or non-identifying fantastic hair person. And what you kind of need to understand from them is they're the ones who are responsible for the success of the business, right, or the organization. Now, again, if you're in a nonprofit thing, it might be the success of satisfying our citizens' needs and renewing their passports with minimal impact, and so forth and so on, and not showing up in front of Parliament or Congress to answer why things went wrong. But whatever those motivations are, the bosses, if you will, they're the ones who are first going to be looking at productivity and very interested in it. Now, there's great reasons why they would be interested, and I'm going to shift into the commercial area. Hopefully, competition isn't something that you have your governments doing too much. That tends to not go very well. But generally, you might have competition in the industry you're in, right? So we had Bowl up here earlier, which is well, here's a joke. How do you know if an American's an expat? Because they tell you. And so when I moved here to the Amsterdam about 6 years ago, Amazon wasn't here at all because Bowl was here and they were great, right? And they still are pretty great. They're very competitive, right? So from their perspective, the more they can get features out, the more their software drives things, the more they can succeed. Now, admittedly, Amazon's pretty good now. You order from Germany, which is great. Great thing about Europe is things just ship around really quick. It's kind of like ordering from Kentucky when I was back in Texas, I guess. So they're interested in shipping features, right? They're interested in getting parity with their competitors, being better than their competitors. And this really manifests as just ship, right? Get features out. They're not really interested in updating your Java VMs and things like that. So that's the way they're going to be measuring things and interested in. And then, of course, as I mentioned, they're interested in growth. They want to make more money, right? As many of us probably do. And if you don't need the extra money, I'll be available after here with a large bag if you're satisfied with the amount you have. So they'll be interested in this, and they'll also be interested in how do we increase productivity in kind of a financial thing that if we want to enter a new market or do more business. Can I just like get 10 more developers and I'm going to get better productivity, right? Or do I need to focus on making what I have productive? Do I need to do more with the same, right? And so this is the kind of thinking that went into the side of that nerd fight we didn't like, where managers of companies wanted to know how to program the system and get observability into how their software function was working. Now, of course, the reason that I would advise you to really think about your metrics is the other thing our white-toothed friend is thinking about is I don't really understand the connection between all of this stuff. I've got one thing I can do, and that is pay less, right? So when I'm managing the IT function that I have, this is why in regular companies you see a lot of IT under the CFO, because the CFO's job is to be like, how about I don't pay that much? I mean, I'm grossly simplifying it, but as perspective for IT, it's sort of like, how do I get what I need with the lowest cost? And think about, if it's like August and you're in Texas, which is very hot, you don't want to paint the outside of your house on your own, like my wife and I did a long time ago. You want to hire someone to do it. Do you hire the most expensive person because they're high quality and they've got like artisanal brushes and they've figured out like the perfect way to paint things and they've talked at conferences? No, you're going to hire like the cheapest or the second cheapest person, right? And it's the same kind of perspective that people will have. So, they're going to go through these things. And again, this is what causes a lot of problems is from their perspective, the way to control costs is people, right? So this is why they want to get down to individual developer productivity measurement. They want to know who are the underperformers that I can get rid of, who are the overperformers that I can retain, and if I'm really cool, maybe give more money, right? Like, so how do I kind of manage that flow of people? And as we know, measuring developer productivity is very difficult. That's the main idea I want you to take away. If anyone asks you about measuring developer productivity, don't tell them. It's only like an inward-facing thing that you want to focus on, unless you're in what is it? The growth-oriented. I forget the door of 3 columns of success and doom, depending on which way you go. If you're in a cool place, talk about it all the time. And then, of course, I think it was called SPSS. I think if we were talking about Delphi and Turbo Pascal from that era, there was this idea of you can track these things to improve your own craft and get better, right? Like it's good to like keep up with those metrics, but that's more of an inward-facing thing that you have, which is great. You should do that, or not, right? But that's not really, as you can tell, what my concern is, right? I think the individual craftsperson, they can metric and do things on their own, and it'll be pretty much cool. So let's go over what developer productivity is, kind of dive into it some more. Well, to emphasize the point, it of course depends, right? Like, which I think is a very accurate answer, but not a helpful one, right? Like, it's not really going to like push you forward into doing things. So just, thankfully, one of the great outcomes of this this nerd fight was Kent Beck wrote a 2-series reply in the is it the software engineering newsletter? I should meet that guy. He lives here, and our wives kind of know each other. But like, thinking about productivity in any area is basically like the amount of effort I put in, the outcome that I get, and can I lessen this as much as possible, right? And how much of that productivity will be? That could be cost, time, friction. And the way you measure this, right, it's not just output, but it's really like, if you'll forgive the marketing terms, it's the impact. It's the value to the customer, the money that you make, the time you reduce that passport renewal, whatever it may be, right? So that's your basic framework for productivity. And then if you apply that to application development, right, it's all about this cycle that the Bull people kind of that went over in one of their slides, that kind of product management cycle is what's a problem or an idea, how do we implement it, how do we design it, how do we code it, how do we test it, then we got to get it out to the users, and this part is the part, when I was a programmer, we didn't do. We only monitored when people were suffering with bug reports. But you actually monitor the people using it and see if behavior has changed. And then you say, is that good or bad behavior, right? And this is kind of the productivity cycle that we have in software, right? You're putting things out there. You've got to see if you get the outcome that you wanted. And maybe cost, right? Like, but the productivity you're kind of getting through here is like, are we actually making a difference, right? And so that's a good thing to start paying attention to of what you end up tracking with a lot of positive metrics. So in an it depends situation, what you end up doing is you're going to a buffet or a cafeteria, right? or one of those places where I guess nowadays there's those hot pot places where you've got all these ingredients and you can pick from the metrics and you throw them together and you can cook them yourselves and feel a little weird the next day. But similar experience for metrics, probably. So let's go a little bit more into what these metrics are, kind of a history of them, if you will. So all of us here, we probably know the DORA metrics. There's 4 of them, right? And these are a good way of measuring that sort of like impact and outcome, right? These are sort of like, depending on the values you have, some of the ideal states that you'll be in. But they don't necessarily tell you about the productivity of what developers' activities are. They tell you if the factory is operating well, right? And they tell you all sorts of other things. We're here to DevOps Days. I'm sure y'all have read the Accelerate book 5 times and got lots of bookmarks and things like that. But they're great from that perspective, right? But more, as I was saying, more of what thinking about developer productivity and metrics has evolved into is looking at the activities as much as that's kind of disliked of what developers are doing, but looking at it with respect to sort of like their day-to-day work, the flow that they have, the way they're thinking about things. And as you can see, these are just a sample from the space framework. But it really starts getting to the point that here's all these kind of attributes that we can monitor, including the sort of well-being and the mental niceness, the kind of like mid-era DevOps vibe that we had before we went into the observability era. But all your sort of cultural stuff, right? And it's a great framework for kind of, again, like buffeting that stuff out. Now, more recently, I'm going to call it the DevX framework. I don't know if it has a title, but from that same group, that came out. And again, it's this buffet, if you will, that you can go to. And what it's trying to get at, as I was saying earlier, is that we know when we look at it what a hygienic, well-running software factory looks like. And what that looks like is this flow through it, right? And what it also looks like is people are happy, right? Or satisfied, depending on how nuanced you want to be with what they're doing. And so it almost starts with what makes people happy, what kind of environment do you set up to encourage this flow, and therefore what metrics are we going to monitor that kind of instrument that factory that we have, right? And then that gets into all of the tools and the way that you start fixing things. Now, there's another area, another group of metrics. I just first heard about it, Monktoberfest last year. From Kat Hicks and friends. They're at Pluralsight, of all places. They picked up the great marketing advantage of the DevOps report, where they're like, what if we contextualize the market we're working in by doing some academic work in here, and think of the leads. And they actually have a very similar sort of study across multiple papers of how you kind of figure out that thriving that you want your developers to have, and kind of all of the little attributes around it. So those are some good buffets for you to go look at. I think they're quite useful for sorting things out. So getting to the tools that you might use, right? And by tools, I don't mean like the excellent overview we saw of the configuration things, the IDEs, those kind of the paintbrushes, to use my old analogy. But these are more those things kind of in the outer loop, if you will, as I was getting to. And the first thing, I keep referencing it because it was great, but if you think about like what the bold people were talking about, product managing your factory, right? That loop. And the thing about product managing is it's good to know your customer and what they're doing. Otherwise, you're just making stuff up, which is nice for like poets and fiction writing, but not really great for sort of engineering sorts of things. So really, I think the state of the art of figuring out what your developers are up to, again, in a large organization with hundreds and hundreds of developers, if you've just got like a handful, you just go have a 90-minute lunch with them and sort it out, which is probably fun. But really, it's just sending surveys out. And this is a survey that we used at Pivotal Labs, now Tanzu Labs VMware by Broadcom or something. And I worked with them a couple years ago to make it free. I think there's a CSV you can download, or whatever. You can copy and paste stuff. But if you look over it, maybe you can read it on the big screen here. But it's asking about tools usage and sentiment, and about how long builds take, all of these attributes that were in our buffet, right? And what you want to do with a survey like this, again, you think about that loop of like, we deploy a solution and then we need to actually monitor it, is you send it out initially, And then depending on what period you want, maybe you send it out in a month, maybe a quarter. And what you're doing there is you've got that kind of instrumentation. You can see if you're improving things, right? Like you want the bad things to go down. Otherwise, you need to try again, right? And so having this kind of input about how is the productivity going based on attributes like this gives you that good sort of feedback loop, that sense of what to do. Now, there's all sorts of other surveys, but there's that one. This is the one that I have on the slide. But there's also some reasoning behind it and things like that, as well as the other ones. So the other thing on that outer loop, and like I always feel a little ridiculous bringing this up at I don't know, I kind of count like the start of DevOps, and I think it was like 2008 or 2009 with the Agile infrastructure presentation from Andrew Schaefer, or Andrew Clay Schaefer, as he fancies himself nowadays. And, because of course we all have configuration, we all have continuous integration and continuous delivery or deployment, I don't know, whatever, in place. But if you don't have that in place, right, then your productivity is going to be a little weird, right? Now, just as a refresher, this is kind of what we're talking about. I'll probably say pipeline after this, right? But like, I think more or less what we figured out, and this is why I think paying attention to this outer loop, I don't like those phrases, but they're pretty good, is important, is in each of these boxes, especially the developer box, I think they kind of know what they're doing. They're like really optimized. Now you could say they're locally optimized, or you could say like they know what they're doing, right? In their domain, things work really well. But of course, as we all know, we might as well shout out praises and acknowledgments. It's those lines between that where really all the problems are, right? The wait times, the dependencies, the passing authority over. This time of year, if you're in Europe, you're like, nothing's happening until September. So we might as well just forget about the velocity of releasing things to get past the architectural board. You've got to schedule meetings, all that kind of nonsense, get your security stuff set up. And so having these kind of pipelines in place and automating them, as we've known, and I'm sure as everyone here does, is extremely important for actually having productivity, right? And you know the history. I think I looked this up, especially for this presentation, and I think Grady Booch, if you remember him, he wears a lot of Hawaiian shirts nowadays, which fantastic. I think maybe in 1994, he had his object orientation book. I think I read that book when I was like 17, and I feel like I was hazed by my fellow programmers for reading through that. And then I did object-oriented Perl, which is super weird in retrospect. But so he kind of wrote about this idea that we should do continuous integration because it'd be great. Then, of course, XP comes out in 1989. I don't know if they got 15 or 20 or 10 sort of principles. And that also has continuous integration. Then we had the lovely ThoughtWorks people, as always, going from radar to implementation at breakneck speed. They had cruise control. Then we had Hudson, then Jenkins. And then, of course, the bimodal IT sort of nerd fight represented there by a fantastic book. And then, as if to say, you can't apply this to everywhere. This guy, Gary Groover, who was working at HP at the time, was like, I do the firmware for printers, and I can do CI/CD for that. And it took him about a year or so, but he wrote that up there. And so, you can pretty much do this for any sort of thing, as I'm sure many of you are doing. But when you talk with your peers after this conference, and they're sort of upset, and they're like, our productivity's not so good, maybe you can be empathetic for them based on this kind of charts that I've been looking at. Now, this is from the State of Agile report. Sadly, they stopped asking this question, and it's gone a little more, when you get, we do this too, but when you get a survey that's in landscape, you're like, I don't know, is this what's going on here? But they've gotten a little, they kind of removed some of this question from it. But you can see I collected it up to 2021. And, surveys, blah, 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 they can be good, bad, whatever. But what I like about this one is that it's many, many years, right? And what you see is the green tells you continuous delivery or deployment or whatever. Someone smarter than me can tell you the difference between those two. And the blue is just like, let's say, automating your build and your test, right? And what's remarkable here, you could almost remove the numbers from it and say, the worst thing is that it's flat. And so we're not necessarily improving as an industry, right? We're not somehow getting better, which maybe is why we're still here having DevOps days. When we get this up to, 75, 80%, maybe we can just shut it down, and we'll have solved the problem. But they did stop that in 2021. But thankfully, thanks to the largesse of the Linux Foundation, the CD Foundation picked up the slack here. And again, surveys, don't worry about the transition of the numbers, but you can see over the years, there's still a small amount of people that are actually doing CI/CD that are not really improving over time. And just to emphasize this point, I always like I like to do a little chart education at least once in my talks. Here's a tip. If you want to emphasize something, do a 100% chart instead of just a bar chart, and then just go crazy with the colors. But here what I've done is, never mind people doing CI, what's the percentage of people not doing it, right? And again, this is probably, what year are we in? You are probably the 29% of people who do it. Congratulations, that's good. But there's a lot of people who are just not automating their build and their test, right? Which is ridiculous. So all this effort you're gonna spend on developer productivity, you're going to have this great box of productivity, and then this, right? It's just going to kind of languish and sit around somewhere. So that's why I start to think about the box that you have around things. The outer loop is important as well. Now, then also, especially for a DevOps crowd, right? We probably know what a platform is, but this is a similar area where if you look at those lines between the boxes, you have a lot of issues, right? Now, thankfully, there's this reference architecture from the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, the CNCF software factory, that kind of defines what a platform is, which is great, because then all of us vendors doing 1-minute pitches, we don't have to give you a vendor pitch about what a platform is. We can be like that, and it's wholesome and good and true, right? But all of us platform people, we pretty much do this. We just don't use Easter colors for things. But these platforms, people are building these out all the time, right? And that becomes quite the issue. You spend a lot of time on that, and it's not only the time you spend building it, but it's the variation that you have across your hundreds of developer teams using things, right? And this sort of was a thrilling moment that we had in the past 5 years, right? Where we were let's strip down all this stuff, all the way down from the platform as a service and the platforms that we had, and let's just build it all the way back up, right? And this has really pulled in a lot of, time building this stuff out. But I think we've emerged from building up from the Kubernetes layer. And now, if we want to focus on improving that kind of flow through the factory, we've got to really address this issue that's persisted for a while, which is you weren't really meant to use this Kubernetes stuff, application developers, or maybe even DevOps people. It's kind of unclear over the years what the thought leaders of the Kubernetes community have thought, although there are some pretty clear statements here and there. But it's this idea of, if we keep building all these platforms, instead of using more standard ones, whether they're open source based or whatever, and even worse, if we have 5, 10, 20 platforms in our organization, you're going to end up having all sorts of issues. Those lines between the boxes will elongate, right? And you see this in a survey we just came out with. We've done a state of Kubernetes survey for about 5 or 6 years, depending on how you count it. And you can see that the more platforms you have, we only ask 4 or more, but the more platforms you have, the more issues that you have, right? And again, it's, anyone who works in infrastructure, that the more different types, the more variations and variability you have, the more annoying it is, right? You've got a context switch between these different things, you have to understand them, and then also you add in the, I can never remember the difference between a combination and a permutation, because, I'm a liberal arts person, but you also bring in all the different development teams using all these different platforms and these different tools, and you're in a mess, right? And so you want to go down to as few platforms as possible. And I think that comes back to the point about developer productivity, right? The tools are important. Of course, you want to go to the buffet, figure out what metrics make sense for your organization so you can talk about the impact that you've achieved. You want to have that inward looking, how am I doing? What's my health assessment for stuff? But then think about the bigger picture, right? Make the grand first generation DevOps move, which is it's the end-to-end process, right? That's really what we're here to solve. But always pull back to that and ask, am I that, was it 68% of people who don't automate their build, or the 29%? I don't think those numbers add up. But we can roll back the tape and look. And really think about how you can focus on that outer loop part. And just as another endorsement, I think what the Bold people went over today was great. What I really like there is they said not only product management, but they were design, which blows people's minds. They're how would I get a designer working with the infrastructure people, right? And the operations people. But that's really what I've seen over the years is if you've got engineers, product manager, and design people, you really get this, you kind of engage in building up that nice outer loop. So then finally, just two things. These are the people, I'm sure there's others, but these are the people I read and listen to the most about developer productivity. They've got a great newsletter there. They also have a great series of YouTube videos. If you're in marketing like I am, I'm thinking of awarding them, I think last year I don't know, I'm thinking of awarding them Best Thought Leadership Marketing Campaign of the Year because they're really cornering this developer productivity conversation. And I mean that in a good way, and also a snarky way. But genuinely, like if you follow what they're doing, you'll get a good sense about the evolution of developer productivity and then metrics. And then, of course, if you're interested in not doing ridiculous platforming, we have many fine pre-shaved yaks at VMware Tanzu by Broadcom, which I would endorse. You can check those out. And with that, thanks for having me. It was nice to see everyone and present here. I appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of the conference.